Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another Political Science 101 recorded lecture. This one is the first of two about interest groups. Interest groups are a central focus of study in political science and have been for a long time. And so in these two videos, I'm going to try to give you an overview of why we think interest groups are so important and what we know about them. There are five main issues we're going to talk about. The first two issues will be in this video, and the last three will be in the second video. So in this video, we're going to talk about what interest groups are, why they came into existence, and some theories about that, what brings them into existence, why are there so many of them. In the second video, we'll talk in more detail about what they do and how they're organized. And then we'll conclude by talking about how they kind of fit into a system that aspires to being democratic. And to launch all of this, let's just get oriented a little bit. Because, we've already covered all the institutions of government. We talked about Congress and the presidency and the bureaucracy and the courts and so forth. And what we're talking about now is, and for the next few weeks, we'll be talking about political institutions as opposed to governmental institutions. In other words, if you recall, when we started the course off, kind of a pyramid, where we talked about a society at the bottom of the pyramid, and in the middle, political institutions, and at the top, government. And we've already talked about the government. And so now we're going to talk about the political institutions. And broadly speaking, all these political institutions, in one way or another, are ways of translating what's going on into the society into political demands that go to the government, and then at some point maybe emerge as public policies that come back down and affect the society. So, here we have a society that is comprised of individuals and groups and corporations and communities and so forth. And there are various ways for individuals and groups to participate in our political system and hopefully influence our government, various ways. And we talked a bit about public opinion surveys. That is actually a form of political participation. But what we're going to talk about over the next few weeks is things like interest groups today, this week, political parties, social movements, the mass media, and elections. These are all, in essence, forms of political participation. And we're going to take them up one at a time. They're all political institutions as opposed to governmental institutions. But they all influence the institutions of government. And those institutions of government then generate the policies. Now, when what you might call a classic model of political participation talks about the main forms of organized participation: interest groups, social movements, and political parties. Again, we're going to talk about all of these. But the key point in understanding all of this is that citizens as individuals normally have very little influence on government. And there are exceptions, people like, Bill Gates or famous, powerful individuals who have a lot of money, a lot of connections with people. There's a handful of people who, as individuals, can impact politics. But the real action in the American political system is organization, and it really is true that a small group of people can potentially have a substantial impact. And you may be able to think of some examples. Students from a school where there was a mass shooting get themselves organized, and suddenly they're on television and members of Congress are listening to them. I realize many organizations don't have influence, but the point is that it is always a potential for any organized group to find its way through the media or into the offices of a public policymaker. It can happen, and it does happen. As individuals, though, very few of us are able to influence people in politics by ourselves. And as I said, there are many different ways to organize. You can organize as an interest group, which we're going to talk about. You can work with through political parties or through social movements, and I think you'll find when you start comparing them that these are all different ways of doing some of the same things that, and one may appeal to you more than others. And I'll just one little caveat, as I said, there are other ways of participating besides interest groups, parties, and social movements. Many people find ways because of social media, have found ways to be influential by simply taking pictures or recording events on their cameras and posting them online. And we all know about instances where that has happened, instances of police brutality or police murder of civilians have been recorded by people, passers-by, who found ways to post it and circulate it, and it has brought about prosecutions and what's going on around the world in various areas where there's conflict happening, wars and conflict. We see citizen journalists shooting video and posting it online. So these are things that were never possible until the invention of cell phones and other forms of video recording equipment. The beating of Rodney King in Los Angeles that led to a prosecution of police officers and a massive social uprising in Los Angeles. All that started, and it only would have happened because a citizen videotaped something. This was with his own video camcorder. So, point being, there are other ways to participate, but we're going to talk about the main ones: social movements, political parties, and interest groups. But just always keep in mind there are other ways to participate. So now let's jump right into this. What are interest groups? And I've given you some of the logos here so you can see some of them. There are lots of them. What is an interest group? Well, first, an interest group, interest groups have different names. They are sometimes referred to in the news media and elsewhere by other terms such as special interest groups, or pressure groups, or advocacy groups, or lobbies. The term used mostly in political science is interest groups. What are they? They are voluntary associations. Almost all of them are organized as not-for-profit corporations. They are protected, and this is a key term that you should expect, we expect you to understand, a key concept. They are protected by the First Amendment right to peaceably assemble and petition the government for redress of grievances. That's right out of the First Amendment. So when people tell you and politicians say they're going to get rid of interest groups, when anyone says they're going to do that, you can officially laugh in their face because that is not possible. They are protected. Political organization to influence the government is protected by the First Amendment to the Constitution. It's a very important point to keep in mind. Even though we often get frustrated with what they do, but this is just a fact. Normally, they focus on a single issue area. Now, this is why they're called interest groups, because they have a special interest. They have a single interest. They're very focused. And this is a contrast with political parties. Political parties have many, many, many interests. Parties are big organizations that aggregate people interested in many different issues. Interest groups have one issue. And another thing about this is that a lot of them are economic. Now, not all, but as you'll see, a huge percentage of interest groups have an interest that is largely economic. There are ideological interest groups too, and public interest groups, but most of them arise around the economic interests of their members. They have only one function, which is to influence government, to influence public policy, and they are very well organized to do that. That's what they're for. That's what they're all about. They use usually what we think of as conventional channels of influence. That is, they go at the institutions of government. They go at the executive branch, including presidents and governors and bureaucracies. They try to lobby agencies, agency decisions. They try to influence administrative rulemaking. They influence the courts, and they operate at the state level, the national level, the local level, every level. They try to find any access point where they can accomplish what they want. And they use many strategies. We will be talking about them. But understand, they are active all the time, 24/7, 365. They don't just wait around for elections. Political parties tend to be organized around elections and trying to get people elected to government, staffing the government, so to speak. Interest groups don't do that as much. They do some of that, but parties gear up for election day every 2 years, every 4 years. Interest groups are looking at what's happening. They're trying to influence outcomes in government, and they don't wait for elections to do it, although they do take an interest in elections, yes. But they're active all the time because there are decisions being made all the time, and they want to influence the decisions that come out of the government. Most of them, generally speaking, prefer not to be too partisan. That is, most interest groups want to work with whichever party is in office. And so they don't want to be too Republican or too Democratic. They want to, often they'll give money to both parties. Now, some are not that way. Some are ideological, and they do pick sides. Now, organized labor, most organized labor groups, unions, support Democrats. Not all of them, but they tend to be more Democratic. Most business interests, at least in certain sectors such as the oil industry, they tend to support Republicans. But this is not true of an awful lot of interest groups. Many of them, many industries, want to work with whoever won the election, so they aren't really partisan in their contributing. They support incumbents. They tend to support incumbents because incumbents are likely to stay in office. They are in office, they're likely to stay in office. Therefore, the interest groups wants to have influence over them. And another fact is that we've talked about it, but producer interests, such as manufacturers, employers, business interests, are typically better represented than consumers because, we as consumers often don't organize at all. And you may remember this when we talked about Mansur Olson. Here are some of the key types of interest groups. But in the corporate sector, we can think of any number of them. Any agricultural product you can think of has its interest groups. The dairy industry, the meat industry, the poultry industry. Think of any product that comes out of the world of agriculture, and it has its own interest groups, its own lobbies that argue for their interests, farmers of all types. And then in the industrial sector, computer manufacturers, auto manufacturers, they have their interest groups. Every conceivable kind of business interest that you can possibly imagine has some kind of group representing them in Washington and in state capitals to try to advance their interests in the policy process. They all do it. The professions, every profession you can think of has an interest group. Trade associations, for example, attorneys, the American Bar Association, the American Medical Association, university professors is the American Association of University Professors, and on and on and on. Dentists, every conceivable profession has interest groups representing them in Washington and state capitals, real estate agents, and on and on and on. And then, of course, organized labor. Or unions organize themselves. Typically, they have a union. They'll have a union which is with its membership funds and everything, and they'll also set up a political action committee or PAC. And the PAC, and businesses do this too, because when we talk about elections, you'll understand how these work. But they're able to contribute money to influence campaigns through their political action committees. And then there are many other groups that represent sectors of the public. Some of them are called public interest groups or citizen interest groups. They represent groups like seniors, the American Association of Retired Persons, disabled people, various racial and ethnic groups, religious organizations. They all form their own interest groups. There are thousands of them in Washington of all these types. And then there are some that deal with single issues like the environment, guns. I'll give you a couple of examples of those in just a moment. And some are purely ideological. There are conservative interest groups, liberal interest groups that call themselves that. Governments lobby. There are organizations that represent states. There are organizations that represent cities. The National League of Cities. There's a lobby on behalf of counties. And then there are many other types of organizations, that think tanks and charities and so forth, representing the medical industry. We could go on. And just an enormous array of groups that represent interests in our society. And as you'll see, these groups are organized for one purpose, and that is to represent the economic interests of all the people or all the businesses that are affiliated with their interest. So, for example, here's some examples of the way they organize and push against each other. Where gun policy is concerned, we find arrayed a couple of very influential groups. One is the National Rifle Association, which is an interest group that represents the gun manufacturers of the country. Now, they like to say they represent gun owners, and they certainly are active in terms of representing the interests of gun owners, but they really are a firearms industry organization. They represent, Smith and Wesson and Ruger and all these other gun companies. That's where the real juice comes from to keep them going. And they oppose gun control laws and any type of proposed legislation that would restrict the sale of firearms. On the other hand, of that side of that issue, we have the Brady Campaign to prevent gun violence, and they try to advocate on behalf of gun control. And so the two groups compete. They basically fight against each other to influence gun control laws. So the Brady bill was eventually passed. It was called mandating waiting periods to buy guns and background checks. They've tried to ban assault weapons, and on the other hand, we have the National Rifle Association advocating on behalf of very liberalized gun laws that would allow people to carry guns without permits and that sort of thing. So this is the way interest groups work. They get on both sides of issues, and they try to and they compete to win on the issue. Another example would be, here we are, global warming. Greenpeace and other groups, Sierra Club, etc., are in favor of having laws passed that would protect the environment or that would reduce CO2 emissions. And here you see a group of them, just tiny little people, way at the top of a gigantic brown coal power station in Germany, unfurling a flag that says CO2 kills. And they're very influential. Greenpeace and Sierra Club and other environmental organizations are quite influential. On the other hand, we have groups set up by the oil industry, like the Science and Environmental Policy Project, that tries to convince people there's no such thing as global warming and other things that are not true. But this is the effort. There's on both sides of environmental policy, you find interest groups pushing in all ways. And here's a third example: abortion rights. The two largest organizations are the National Abortion Rights Action League, or NARAL, which advocates for what they call pro-choice, which means preventing legislation from being passed that would restrict the right to obtain abortion. So they are in favor of women having the right to abortion, of people having the right to abortion, and they try to protect that right. And then on the other hand, you have the National Right to Life League, or it's just called now National Right to Life, that tries to lobby to get laws passed that would ban abortion entirely. And they think that abortion should be prohibited completely in almost all cases. And so again, on this issue, you see the two groups competing to influence our policies in every level: the courts, legislatures, administrative agencies, everywhere you can think of. Now, I just want to take a moment to talk about ideological interest groups, because they're different, because they don't have an economic interest as such. We find a number of them that are committed to various ideological groups. I would point out, for example, on the religious right, they have a number of such groups: Moral Majority, the Eagle Forum, CPAC, Conservative Political Action Committee, and the NRA. And I put the NRA is a gun control organization, yes, but they have also become much more ideological in recent years, where they started to focus more on a broader range of ideological issues affiliated with the Republican Party. On the progressive side, or the liberal side, the National Organization for Women and MoveOn.org and other organizations have been or are in support of a broader range of progressive or liberal ideological issues. Now, you can learn a lot more about interest groups if you would like to. There's an organization called Open Secrets, and they have a lot of information on this topic. I've given you a picture. You can just look it up. It's opensecrets.org. You can look them up, and you can find out all sorts of things about interest groups and many other related topics by going there. And I always like to encourage people to do their own research on this, and you're certainly welcome to do that. So now let's talk a bit about why interest groups come into existence and when they first began to become a factor in American politics. Where do they come from? And a bit about the whole democratic debate. I mean, do they contribute to democracy, or do they detract from democracy? Let me give you some early examples. Probably the first interest group in the U.S. was the American Anti-Slavery Society. The leader of that initially was William Lloyd Garrison. And they were around from 1833 to 1870 because, of course, slavery was abolished after the Civil War in 1865, and with the amendment of the Constitution, the 13th Amendment. But so they won basically, and then they went out of existence. But they were really one of the first interest groups that was organized nationally, and they focused on one issue, which was just the abolition of slavery. And they were successful. Another group, early interest group, was the Women's Christian Temperance Union. They formed in 1874. They are still in existence. They initially wanted to ban or prohibit the sale of alcohol, and that's what was meant by the term temperance. They later moved on to early on moved on to the issue of women's suffrage. In other words, obtaining the right to vote for women. Well, they won on both of those things. Alcohol was prohibited by constitutional amendment. Women did get the vote by constitutional amendment. And of course, I'm sure you know, and by later constitutional amendment, prohibition was reversed and the sale of alcohol was resumed. But they've had their successes. And they have moved on to many other issues as well. They are still in existence. The WCTU still exists. And they have a broader social reform agenda. It has always had kind of a religious basis, but they have advocated for many things having to do with broad social reform and social welfare issues. On the other hand, we have business interests. One of the earliest organizations to get itself set up to influence government was Standard Oil. Which was formed in 1870. That's John D. Rockefeller's company, the Rockefeller family, the Rockefeller Foundation. And they used to have a joke. They used to say that Standard Oil, which first became organized in Pennsylvania, because Pennsylvania back in the late 1800s had a lot of oil in it. And they pumped a lot of it out. They used to joke and say that Standard Oil did everything to the Pennsylvania state legislature except refine it. In other words, like turn it into oil. They had so much influence over state legislatures. And that was part of John D. Rockefeller's strategy, was to get the company organized and get the industry that he was in, the oil industry, organized to influence state legislatures. And the same thing went on in the railroad industry, where they got themselves very well organized in the 1800s to influence state legislatures and block regulation of their rates particularly. So, and what happened was really that in the late 1800s, a massive reaction began to form against the influence of business over state legislatures and Congress. And that is sometimes called the progressive movement. The progressives came into existence, and many people associate that with, for example, President Teddy Roosevelt, who was vehemently opposed to the powerful organizations that they called trusts. We sometimes call them monopolies these days, but they called them trusts, organized business interests that could do whatever they want and could get governments to authorize anything they wanted to do because they had so much influence over them. So the progressives tried to stop some of that. It's a war that goes on to the present day. The power of organized business interests is enormous in our society. And, many, at the same time, in the late 1800s, many professions began to organize. The American Medical Association, the American Bar Association, the National Association of Manufacturers, and so forth. And then along came organized labor, the union movement. Early unions began to get underway after the Civil War in this country, and they began to organize to influence politics. And they have, over time, served as a kind of a counterweight or a counterbalance to organized business interests. Although the fact is there's a lot more money and power in business interests than there is in organized labor. So let's talk a bit about how these groups came into existence. Why? I mean, why did they emerge in the late 1800s? Why do they still proliferate? Why are there new ones popping into existence? New interest groups, new lobbying groups all the time? Well, they are responding to changes in the political environment. So imagine that we have a profession, a trade, a business, whatever it might be. You know, at one time there were people rented video cassettes, and it was a big business. Well, there were lobbying organizations working on behalf of the video cassette industry. Well, that's gone now. We don't even know, nobody uses them anymore. Now we use other forms. Now we have, for example, music and films that are digitized that we're streaming. Well, now there's a Netflix. There are other organizations that have organized to influence the government. Why? Because technology changed. The reactions to technology from legislators changed. And whenever a government, state or federal, rises up and says, wait a minute, I think we're going to regulate this new thing that's happening, computers or something that's streaming into our rooms over our computers. Whenever the government says they're going to do something about it, interest groups form because they feel threatened. And so as government has grown in its size, as government has expanded in its functions, so have interest groups. In the energy industry, for example, oil and gas, when we began to do this thing called fracking, suddenly there are groups organized to promote or fight against fracking. Well, it wasn't being done 50 years ago, and now it is, and now the groups exist. Education, they try to influence education. When government it passes or tries to pass any kind of regulation or spending bill about education, groups form to try to influence that. The environment, healthcare, social welfare, and on and on. And there have been many other groups that have formed really out of generational changes. The baby boom generation, many people believe, gave rise to what some people have called the new politics movement, meaning in the 70s and 80s, civil rights groups, anti-war groups, ideological groups representing the interests of the baby boom generation began to form. And as I said, advances in communications and technology lead to changes in industry. They lead to changes in the products that we have. They lead to government saying, let's regulate, something that we're seeing on our computers for the first time. It's time to stop this. You may have seen people saying that the government should do something about the influence of bots or people creating thousands and thousands of fake social media sites and pumping out the same message to influence our politics. And when this happens, now that the technology exists, people say, let's have government regulate it. Well, as soon as they say they're going to do that, as soon as government threatens to regulate something, groups will form to try to prevent it, and other groups will form to try and promote it. So interest group formation responds to changes in the political environment. And I'll wrap this up with a few slides that will kind of restate some things we talked about earlier. There are two approaches to this whole theory of group formation. Arthur Bentley, we'll just call him Bentley, came up with a theory, and he said, well, groups are central to human existence, and whenever groups are threatened, they organize. And so he called it disturbance theory. So as I said earlier, if an industry feels threatened by government, they organize. And that's probably true. Probably any industry or any profession that feels threatened by government action is going to organize. On the other hand, though, Mansur Olson, in his book, The Logic of Collective Action, which I've talked with you about before, he says, well, it's not that simple. Not all groups that are threatened by government actually get organized. Some remain what he called latent groups. They never organize. And he says the issue, you have to look at the individual. It has to be in each individual's interest to join the group. So even though a group may be threatened, unless the individuals in the group feel that it's worth joining, they won't join. And that's why he said producer interests, like let's say the people who build computers, sell computers, who sell our smartphones and so forth. They're producers. We're the consumers. Well, we know the producers are organized to block regulation of what they do, of the sale of their products. But are we, the consumers, organized? And Mansur Olson would point out that there are hardly any consumer organizations of any size. There are very few. We consume all these products, we buy them, but we don't organize to protect our interests. And that's because as individuals, it isn't worth it. Each individual, does not see it in their interest to organize and join a group and contribute to it to influence our politics. And so he says that's why interest group politics and group formation is weighted in favor of producer interests and against consumer interests. And then lastly, I just remind you what we talked about before. It's this model of asking the question of how does this all fit with democracy, which we'll take up in the second video. But remember pluralism, the idea that down here in the base of society, individuals organize when their groups are when their interests are threatened. They form groups, and then they compete to influence government. Now that's what we're going to take up in the second video. How they do it: lobbying, campaign contributions, lawsuits, influencing public opinion, and other things. But interest group competition, that's what they live for. And lastly, for the first video, let's keep in mind that there is another type of interest group that we sometimes call the public interest group. That is, groups that form to try to do something good for some segment of the public. Common Cause is one of those examples, and Andrew McFarland of our political science department is the leading authority on that. He's a retired UIC political science professor, wrote a book about Common Cause. And the point there is, in his view, and in the view of other leading political scientists like Robert Dahl, interest group competition, I'm trying to balance this off. There's a lot that's been kind of negative about it, but another view says, well, they're not all bad, because if you have enough interest groups representing enough interests, including public interest groups, you can end up with a system that they call polyarchy, meaning it is not really a democracy, but it isn't really elite rule either. That the interest groups competing with each other support a system of representation of us, of all of us. So even if you're a gun owner, even though you may not participate in government, the NRA does, and when they are successful, they're protecting your interests. If you advocate on behalf of the environment, you believe in it, but you don't join any group, well, if the environmental groups are successful in influencing public policy, don't you benefit as well? So that's the idea, that what we have is a system of government that is influenced heavily by organized interests. And it's just because of the First Amendment, that's the way the system is going to continue to operate. And the polyarchy advocates would say, what we have is not really democracy. It's not a perfect democracy. It's not a populist democracy, but it isn't elite rule. And so they view interest groups as a protection against elite rule. Now, not everybody agrees with that. Other people would say, no, this array of interest groups really isn't elite. They are an elite layer. They represent people who have more money, more influence, more likely aligned with producer interests, and that, some people have said, the whole interest group sphere has a strong upper middle class bias because that's who gets organized. But we'll take up more of that in our second video. So thank you very much for listening, and hope you enjoy this and also part 2.